Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the return of a much loved segment that we used to call Muppet of the Month, but we've since decided to rename Heritage Half-Wit because it doesn't have to be a monthly occurrence, it doesn't have to be a weekly occurrence, doesn't even have to be a yearly occurrence. Just when there's a Muppet or a half-wit or a fool that's within our sphere, our purview, then we want to bring it to you and maybe take a little bit of pleasure in highlighting half-wittery and muppetry when and wherever it occurs in archaeology and heritage.
Or in this case, actually make a serious point as well, because although absurdly funny, what we're going to talk about today actually is underlined by some very serious issues.
Yeah. Well, and often they are. I mean, one of the early Muppets I remember us highlighting was a landowner on the England-Wales border who had, I think, torn down or bulldozed a tree and part of the Offa's Dyke as well, filled it in. And on the one hand, that's kind of funny. No one got hurt. It's also a bit tragic. It's also quite serious in so much as it's a monument that's being destroyed. And in this instance, today, what we're talking about is something that, on the face of it, is pure muppetry, pure half-wittery, but also as well has some serious implications. And it all started with a link in Newsweek that I sent over to Andy initially because I couldn't quite believe it.
Neither could I. I mean, it looked like something that was a sort of an outtake from The Onion.
Yeah,
on social media or Private Eye or something like that. It was almost satirical.
Yeah. It read as follows: military to remove Enola Gay photos for violating DEI rules. Enola Gay, of course, was the aircraft that dropped the bomb at Hiroshima, and is a key part of the story of the 20th century. It set the groundwork for so much of what would follow in terms of the nuclear age and what people commonly understand as being simultaneously horrifying, but also as well a crucial point in human history. It shaped the foreign policy of Japan for the next 80 odd years. So. In terms of
the United States, it's actually preserved as a national monument.
Yeah.
But
it was being dropped because it had the word gay in it.
Which actually was the name of the pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets's mother.
Other instances of people called gay. Apparently, there's I think I learned the other day, 2.5% of the American population, the US population rather, is called has the surname Gaylord, which must be difficult at the best of times. But right now, for example, here we have Army Corps engineers, a photograph of them dredging in a project in California, had photos of that project flagged because one of the engineers had the last name Gay. So gay, LGBTQ, people of color, and also as well women are being targeted by this project. And I suppose the question is, or this initiative, I guess, and the question is, who is to blame? Is it an individual? Is it the Pentagon's sweeping AI algorithm? Is it just going, oh no, it says gay? I mean, to be fair, later on in the story, it does say that the images were the Pentagon's directive to remove the DEI-related content resulted in 26,000 images, more than 26,000 images being flagged. And but in this instance, thankfully, obviously common sense won over, and the Enola Gay will not be being ripped out of the museum where it's currently housed.
I like to think, though, that there's an I am Spartacus moment here. I'd like to think that the Enola Gay would say, look, if people who also served in the American Armed Forces, who happen to be black or brown or women, or to have been part of the LGBTQ plus community, if they're going to be purged from the Pentagon's photo archive, I'll stand with them and be purged as well, because it just shows how absurd this particular exercise is. And you talked about the Pentagon's algorithm. I think we need to be very clear why this is happening. It's happening because of a presidential executive order that was one of the first that President Trump actually signed into
Put
action
his big
on January
boy
20th.
Sharpie marker to, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I've got it in front of me here. It's dated the 20th of January, the day of the inauguration.
Yeah.
And it's titled "Presidential Actions: Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing." DEI for it's an American term. It has different terms in other parts, different meanings in other parts of the world. These actions have different meaning in other parts of the world. But in America, it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was an attempt, programs which attempt to address issues whereby there's historical injustice, basically in the provision of services or the recognition of service, or equality of opportunity between people of different ethnic backgrounds and so on. So it's an attempt to be good. It's an attempt to be kind to people.
Well, to be kind is one way of putting it,
and fair.
And fair is a better way. But yeah, absolutely, equity is the crucial aspect here. Absolutely. And people often talk about institutional problems, institutional racism, institutional bias, and that doesn't necessarily have to. I'm not saying it doesn't in some cases, but it doesn't necessarily have to be due to bias, which is rooted in a form of prejudice or even hatred. It can simply be that people don't think to hire things that they don't think to hire, or people that they don't, people from groups or products or ways of working. That it's all about your exposure, and in the same way that as has been highlighted throughout my lifetime, young women saying if they can't see it on TV, if they can't see it in daily life, then they don't know that they can aspire to be it. It also works from the other side of that glass ceiling as well. If you're a manager making decisions about who to hire, if you've never seen a female pilot, then you may never think to hire a female pilot. You may be surprised that they exist. So it exists for a good reason. And speaking of women, part of probably this same initiative, we've seen NASA have what was called a drop everything order to get rid of all mentions of women in leadership roles from the NASA website. We've seen in aircraft and pilot training in the Air Force mentions of black and female pilots who fought in the Second World War being dropped from the training. And what's interesting here is that when I first sort of highlighted this elsewhere, someone commented saying, this is about equity because it means that we can now mention men again, this kind of thing. We can specifically, it means that actually we're not having to be careful about who we mention and how we mention them. But it's so, again, I think this is to do with a sort of cultural willful blindness, in so much as what's happening is a period of redressing a balance, because since the First World War, aircraft training and the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, has been about men and European men, white men, American men in that sense. And just think about, I don't know, one of the first great pilots of any military, the Red Baron, so aristocratic bloody men as well, not least. So, and some of these same sort of initiatives eventually led to people who were, men, but also men who were from, for example, mining backgrounds being acknowledged for their roles in conflict. Everyone benefits from this sort of, this taking a moment and going, are we blind here to something? Are we focusing in on people like the Red Baron when actually, it's people, it's other people from other backgrounds and other ways of working and doing that actually make sure that this whole thing works. Now, obviously, I'm describing this in a very positive way, and in a very sensible way. But is it fair to say that what we have here with the current U.S. administration is a sort of a callous approach to all? I don't like part of this, therefore all of it must be wrong. Do you think there's something going on there?
I think there's a massive sense of insecurity in people's identity going on with, and it's, certain privileged, older, middle-aged to older white men who have felt under pressure, under siege for some years now, and there's been pushback in social media and so on. We've seen it in the way that Elon Musk has reinstated people like Andrew Tate onto Twitter, ex-Twitter.
And people like Mark Zuckerberg talking about the need for masculine energy and this kind of thing.
Absolutely. And from being a sort of fringe whinge, to call it one, it's become mainstream. And what we're seeing in the DEI purge in the USA is it is absurd. It's black comedy in terms of what the Pentagon tried to do there. But it's actually deep underneath that. It's deeply serious, and it stems from the very top of the U.S. administration. But I mean, I just go backtrack a little bit. I think it's worth, again, just to put the whole thing in perspective. You talked about, and you initially shared with me the Newsweek account of this. A lot of running on this was also made by Associated Press. And I'm just reading from their website article about this particular issue. They say, quote, Associated Press obtained a database of tens of thousands of Department of Defense website images that have been flagged for removal or already removed for having content that highlighted diversity, equity, or inclusion. Images highlighting female service members' contributions have been removed, as have images highlighting Black, Hispanic, and Pacific Islander contributions to the military, among others. The database Associated Press obtained contained 26,000 images that were flagged, and that may only be a fraction of the content that's being removed. Now, that was their initial reaction. I mean, just in the US Marine Corps alone, they identified 10,000 images and stories for removal online, of which 3,600 were removed. And that doesn't count social media sites. This was just on website. This was just website.
Yeah, and it also coincides with the Pentagon, for example, dropping things like celebrating Black History Month,
absolutely,
Women's International Women's Day, this kind of thing. It's regressive, and it lacks a sort of a sense of common humanity, and crucially,
it's also go on.
Well, and crucially, I remember a few years ago now, during the first Trump administration, there being a big sort of furore over the removal of certain Confederate general statues from certain towns in the South. And people who are of that persuasion, who are likely to be MAGA voters, saying, you can't erase history! You can't erase history! Whereas actually what the statues were doing and what was happening to the statues was that they were being recontextualized. More often than not, they were being moved to somewhere else. Maybe just off the plinth and to the corner, and just being given a little bit less prominence. They weren't being erased. And people who think that removing a statue means that you're going to forget about, I don't know, whichever general it was. I know there's an irony there in so much as I can't name a general, but I haven't studied the Confederacy. But the idea that you're going to forget about the American Civil War and key figures by moving a statue is ridiculous. But going through and flagging in such a broad scope that even people who happen to have the surname Gay
Yeah.
for erasure and, in that sense, censorship, is literally attempting to change history, and it's trying to change the way that people think about what achievement in the military or achievement, for example, in the space agency looks like. And again, it goes back to so many women who have told me over the years, if you can't see it, you can't be it.
Yeah.
And clearly, this administration, that orange man, wants there to be fewer women feeling like they can be astronauts. It's
Well, I mean,
gross.
I think, yeah, it is gross, and I think, and it's counterproductive as well. You know, but what talent is being lost
Yeah,
by what talent will be lost in the future when
by dismissing half the population at
by
least.
dismissing half the population who are broadly speaking who would identify as women. The percentages, the large percentages of the population who identify as in the States as Hispanic or Native American or whatever, or black. And I think the other thing is just the crude way this has been executed. Now, obviously, the Trump administration has adopted, and we've seen it. We saw it in our discussion about DOGE, Doge, or dodgy as I like to call it, because it is very dodgy what Elon Musk is doing. But in our discussion with Morgan Kinney, they're applying very crude tools to this to move fast and break things, as Silicon Valley likes to say. Move fast and blow up rockets over most of the Caribbean, as Elon Musk is currently doing. But I mean, just point out that Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, very controversial appointment, relatively inexperienced for such a huge job.
Relatively inexperienced. He's a Fox News host who apparently has a bad drinking problem.
Yeah, who, to be fair to him, did serve with the U.S. National Guard, so at least he's worn a uniform. But yes, you're right. He has alleged drinking problems. He has alleged far right tattoos from his military service days.
Right.
Now, one of his first actions was to break with precedent and fire 2 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of whom happened to be a black general and the other whom happened to be a woman admiral.
Yeah.
Is there a coincidence there in all this? And on the 26th of February, the Pentagon ordered all military branches of military service to look at their website postings, photos, news articles, videos on YouTube, whatever, and remove anything that mentioned that, quote, promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if they couldn't do that by a very tight deadline, they were told to, quote, temporarily remove from public display all content published during the Biden administration's 4 years in office.
Nothing says confident military man quite like those sorts of actions. It's pathetic. It's simply pathetic. And I suppose you could say that maybe if there is another election, some of this stuff will be changed again. But this flipping and flopping that the US is doing at the moment, from one extreme, to an extreme, and then an attempt to course correct back to some sort of internationally recognized normality, and then back to the extreme again. I happened to catch earlier today. This isn't relevant directly to this story, but I happened to catch earlier today a Canadian YouTuber. He's an older man whose YouTube channel is all about making radios. He makes radios. He works with synthesizers and sound equipment, this kind of thing. And he was in his workshop, and he couldn't bring himself to film that day. So instead, he just said, "Look, I can't. I'm not. My mind is so wired right now by what's happening." And he just said, I'm just going to talk to half of my audience, and that is people from the US. So he just stood and talked to the camera for a bit. And his main concern was about the fragility of institutions and the way in which course correction isn't always possible. And you said, there's that sort of Silicon Valley, Elon Musk kind of approach of move fast and break things. And he's genuinely concerned, or he was genuinely concerned that the international norms of, for example, trade that were established in the North American, I think, and Mexico trade deal a few years ago, that specifically said we won't be putting tariffs on our neighbors, has been
which was negotiated by
by
one Donald J. Trump, the great deal maker.
Yeah, the great deal maker. That's gone, that's been trampled on, and that sort of trust isn't easily won back, So it's a fragility of trust. In that sense, he described it as the institution of trust with your neighbors. But he was also talking about simple things like what we've been talking about here. The fact that once you start to break what people feel is allowed in public discourse, it's really hard to get that back again. I mean, heck, we saw it a few years ago here with the introduction of GDPR rules about who can learn what information, how and when, and what information can be passed out about people. That has been so misunderstood that people won't give out information just in case they break the rule. And it's still the case, no matter how much training you put out there. And this sort of broad sweep initiative, this sort of memo that goes out saying drop everything and get rid of women off the NASA website, it's so memorable and so wide-reaching that people, I think, for a long time will be kind of scared to risk breaking the rules because no one wants to lose their job. It's the breaking of things that really is the shame here. And of course, the motivation behind that breaking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think it runs really deep and dangerous when we look at issues like, for example, some of the images that have been removed have been images showing exclusively black service personnel during World War II. I'm looking at a picture of black service personnel, USAAF Air Force armourers in training. The famous Tuskegee Airmen have also been mentioned in this connection. The squadron of black American fighter pilots who, against all the odds, managed to get themselves commissioned into a frontline combat squadron and fought in Europe during World War II. Very famous movies have been made about them, and images of them have been taken down. And not only is that removing role models from, say, a black kid who might want to be a pilot, it's actually erasing a discussion of a part of American military history, because at that time the American armed forces were segregated. There were fights in Britain in the during World War II when American military police tried to remove black service personnel from English pubs where white American service personnel were drinking. It's an important issue. It's important to remember these things, and I think, in terms of the archiving, you were talking about how difficult it might be to reinstate certain things. I think our colleagues who work in archive will be looking at this with horror, because it is showing quite how vulnerable electronic archives are. A simple search and a key press can erase hundreds, thousands of images.
And on the one hand, I can only hope that there are well-minded, good-minded archivists who are doing their best to preserve information that just because it's doesn't have to be prominent, but it can be preserved. We shouldn't have to be relying on that, and indeed American citizens shouldn't have to be relying on essentially rebel record keepers.
We've seen initiatives on things like the Wayback Machine and so on, where people are trying to archive these websites, and it's not just historical material from Pentagon websites. It's things like the Center for Disease Control, and so on, where important medical information is being erased because it happens to have the wrong trigger words for the Trump administration.
Incidentally, I'll link below to an article about research and trigger words, which I recently put out. So this is meant to be a heritage half-wit. Is this half-wittery? Obviously, we can point to the person who signed the directive, executive order.
Yeah.
Is this half-wittery not just half-wittery, but actually vandalism?
It can be all of the above, can't it? Because there is the half-wittery. You know, the Enola Gay thing. You know, as we said at the beginning, it was self-satirical. It was self-satirizing. It looked, you know, how could that possibly be true? And yet it was. At the same time, underneath it is this racism and misogyny.
And frankly, mediocre men.
From mediocre men, yeah. From insecure men who feel that the only way to protect their positions is to lash out at people who can't defend themselves anymore. Like, you know,
or instead of lashing out at Russia, lash out at Canada
or Greenland.
Yeah. It's sad.
It's sad. I mean, I'd make one other point as well. When we're talking about the responses to this. So you mentioned the Newsweek article. I mentioned AP, Associated Press, and I did that very deliberately because, as well as making some of the running on this and publishing a very good article on the background and effect of what Trump signed into, not into law actually, because executive order is just that. It's an order. It can be it can be
challenged,
countermanded. It can be challenged in court.
Yeah, but but in this instance, it has a particular direct effect because he is the commander in chief. So in that sense, he can affect the bureaucracy of the armed services, and
although he's meant to act at all times within the Constitution. Not that he's probably ever read it. No, I mentioned AP specifically as well. Associated Press were barred by the White House press secretary from White House press events because they refused to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America as per another executive order. AP said that basically they're an international news organization. If they were publishing a story that was internal to the United States, they would follow the executive order. But if they're talking to the rest of the world recognizes the Gulf of Mexico, as do we on the Watching Brief. And you know, that's been the case for hundreds of years. There's no reason to change every single map and atlas now just for the sake of somebody who's only going to be in office for, well, we hope, a maximum of 4 years.
But remember, erasing history is wrong. Erasing
history is not possible. I mean, if you remember, there's the wonderful dystopian Ray Bradbury novel Fahrenheit 451, where it hypothesizes a society where books are banned. There's the ultimate book burning. Firefighters in the story go around burning books.
Yeah, and you know, my first exposure to that was a cold reading in a GCSE exam. I had no idea what I was reading. I just remember they clearly chosen a passage where you're meant to go, oh, it's firefighters, this is good, and then suddenly, oh my God, they're burning the books. But the point is, the optimistic part of the story is that individuals memorize the great works of literature and go around as, you know, Pride and Prejudice and War and Peace or whatever, you know. The idea being that the human spirit will somehow supersede these dystopias. And I think we have to face it. We can call them a Muppet, we can call them a heritage half-wit, we can, you know, what is being created at the moment is a cultural dystopia. And I think that should be a concern to everybody, even people who maybe voted for President Trump in the hope of a better America, a greater America. This isn't a greater America. This is actually a diminution of what America is and represents. Yeah, if nothing else, just to add a slightly light spin on the end here, if nothing else, it's boring. frankly. I mean, just imagine if all you could watch on YouTube was you and me.
Exactly.
God, that would be boring.
Yeah. Exactly. Hairy-faced white men.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Well, folks, hopefully you've enjoyed this return of the Muppet / Half-Wit series. We will be keeping more of an eye out for this because I think actually this levity is it's good for the soul, especially at times like this. So we'll keep on keeping on with this series. And if you have any suggestions, please do comment below. Let us know. Sorry, Andy. Go on.
I was going to say that satire is important. Laughter is important. There's a wonderful French film called Ridicule, which is about the culture of the court of Louis XIV and the importance of if someone was pompous, pretentious, whatever, of bringing them down with a little bit of ridicule. I think that's good for everybody.
Yeah. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.